Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 805 Uncensored, a podcast about radical politics, history, current events, music, and more. I'm your host, Jordan Barney, and this is episode number 43. Today on the show, we got a very special guest and one of our highest profile guests ever, Owen Symes. He's a socialist, historian, and author of the book He Was Our Man in Washington, A History of the Obama Years. Thanks so much for coming on the pod, Owen. It's a pleasure to
Yeah,
speak with you.
thanks for having me.
Yeah, anytime. So, first things first, you mind just introducing yourself to our listeners for people who are not familiar with you and some of the work that you've written?
Yeah, so as you said, I'm a historian. This is my first book. From Pennsylvania, but I live in Michigan. I got my BA in history from Hillsdale College, which you might not know being in California, but it's a small, fiercely conservative liberal arts college in Michigan. So most Michiganders that are political are kind of aware of its existence. So it's kind of ironic that coming from that milieu, I end up writing, a very left-leaning history of recent American events. Um, like I said, this is my first book, so I don't really have a lot of backlog of other content because I spent a lot of time trying to get this together. So this is my first foray into putting these ideas out there and seeing, what people have to say about them.
Well, great. I loved reading it, and you had a lot of very fascinating points throughout it. So, I guess my first question for you is, what inspired you to write this book in the first place?
Donald Trump, I mean, to put it frankly, I was pretty apolitical
It's good
during
reason.
Obama's. Yeah, I mean, he mostly hate him, but love him or hate him, he definitely gets people to do things one way or the other, right? So during Obama's presidency, I was very apolitical. At the very beginning of it, I was in college. I voted for McCain, but after the 2008 election was over, I kind of lost interest. Didn't join like any political clubs or anything like that. Just kind of concentrated on studying history and philosophy. And after college, I got married. I worked a bunch of random jobs. I was a psychiatric technician. I was a call center supervisor. Kept reading history, kept reading philosophy, but not really paying attention to current events. And then all of a sudden, 2016 comes along. We get a reality TV star as president. And so I thought, well, okay, that's kind of a wake up call. Politics is a little stranger than I thought it was. So I started researching, okay, what happened with the immediate predecessor to Trump? Did he have anything to do with how we got to this position? And then, of course, the more I researched, the deeper the questions got. And it was less about how did Trump get elected and more just about how does America work as an institution? How did we develop as a country? How did these power relations form? How did the people that are on the margins get there in the first place? And so what I ended up writing was a book that tried to answer all these questions that I ended up asking myself, that I hadn't been privy to while I was being educated, that I hadn't thought about asking when I was growing up. A lot of this stuff was very new to me. I spend a lot of time in the book talking about the history of, say, African Americans, because that's stuff that I didn't really know very much about, even with a history background. So I thought, well, if I don't know this context, surely a lot of other, at least white people, don't know it either. So I might as well throw that in as context for the book that'll help explain, what happened or didn't happen while Obama was in office.
No, for sure. I find that very fascinating. So, would you say that throughout the Obama years that you were relatively apolitical?
Oh, 100%. I didn't vote in 2012. Like I said, I voted for McCain in 2008. But that was because, at the time, I fed into that conservative mindset of Obama's a radical socialist, and he's going to upend the whole system, and that's against Western values and the Judeo-Christian tradition and all those other kind of conservative buzzwords. Even by the time I graduated college in 2012, I had come to kind of question that meta narrative, that overarching story, that the Western heritage was this unique, consistent, fully formed thing that had developed over thousands of years. Even in college, I got to read Marx and Foucault and Rousseau and these guys that really tried to question the validity of that quote unquote tradition. So I get out of college, I'm questioning this kind of stuff, but I don't really have an alternative, right? My ideology is kind of it's crumbling, but there's no replacement for it. And so then in 2016, that's when I started to get political again and find an alternative to that conservatism, kind of liberalism I had been raised with, replacing it with a more socialist outlook.
Yeah, no, I find that very interesting. I wanted to get into libertarian socialism, matter of fact, right now. In your introduction, you state that you wrote this book with a socialist approach, and specifically, you clarify that you're not referencing the authoritarian socialist states like the USSR, for example, but rather a libertarian socialism model, a kind of socialism that maximizes freedom for the individual and the collective, but also the true variety of socialism in the sense where instead of the state being in control of the means of production, it's actually the workers.
Yeah, I do make that distinction. Now, I will say, like, I don't like getting into discussions that deeply about, like, oh, tanky versus anarchy or whatever, because
Mhm.
I think leftist unity is important because we haven't gotten to a point where those questions are, at least to me, all that relevant. Like, um, because the fact of the matter is, the capitalist class still has all the political power, right? It's hard from my perspective. It's hard to argue about this stuff all that much when you don't even have political power in the first place. But yeah, my the ideal that I go for is less state control and more like what worker co-ops, more federalized, more decentralized, at least as much as is practicable. Now, obviously, reality kind of runs into that. There are legitimate historical reasons why the USSR went the way it did. Um,
Mhm.
abuses and all, like, it's all very complicated and gray area, and more than a Twitter debate, I think would have one believe, perhaps. But yeah, I definitely lean more on the anarchist side of things, even if I can appreciate some of the reasons why. The decision makers at the USSR in 1920 might have been a little more authoritarian or whatever. It's you make those decisions, within the context of a war. At least it makes sense. It might not have been the right decision, or maybe there could have been an alternative or whatever. Counter historical stuff is always kind of wishy washy because you never really know.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I do make that point in the book. I'm not advocating specifically for Soviet style, socialism necessarily. Yep.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point too. Is it doesn't exactly matter a whole lot when we're arguing about the aesthetics of socialism or communism, tanky versus anarchism right now. Besides, like the online Twitter battles, because really we haven't made enough movement with the left. But I wanted to ask you specifically in really deep blue districts within the country where people are running as Democrats right now and in some cases independents. What if instead of stepping away from that traditional belief, some candidates actually start openly calling themselves socialists? And I'm talking about places that where it's a solid blue, where really no conservative has a chance of winning.
Mm.
What are your views on that?
It's dangerous territory because if you look at, say, the history of the British Labour Party, that's what they tried to do. They tried to galvanize worker support and produce an alternative political party that represented exclusively worker interests, but within the confines of the bourgeois liberal democratic apparatus, with indirect representation, as opposed to like direct democracy. Instead of having worker co-ops, they'd have the factories would remain the same. The means of production were still privately owned, but at least now the workers theoretically had exclusive political representation within the government itself, as that institution already existed. And there were obvious benefits to that. The Labor Party in the 1940s did institute the NHS, the National Health Service. So there were obvious gains. But of course, as we've seen over the last generation or two, the Labor Party has increasingly become just another capitalist party. It doesn't really represent the workers anymore. It represents the rich. And
Hmm.
so, if you're going to do that electoral stuff, Howard Zinn makes the point in the People's History of the U.S. that oftentimes electoral politics is kind of a safety valve for the status quo. It bleeds off energy that might have been put towards more radically productive political projects, like building dual power, alternative institutions, and rechannels it back towards existing institutions through channels that the people in power they already understand, and so they can kind of mold them a little bit. So I think there is benefit to using the apparatuses that already exist, because there are people know how they work, and that's obviously a danger because you know how to defend against them. But if you can take that stuff that you know how it works and try and bend it to your own will and use it in unpredictable ways, there are definite benefits to that. So I think if you're going to do stuff like that, you just have to be really, really careful in the long term. Where are your priorities being directed? Because it might be a slow process. You might not realize it at first, but like with the British Labour Party, it seems pretty clear somewhere along the way their priorities no longer represented the working people of Great Britain. So it's a dangerous road to tread, and I don't think it should be like the exclusive way that we direct our efforts. But you can definitely have short-term gains within the electoral system. Medicare and Medicaid are examples of that in the U.S. Like, as limited as those programs are, they do help a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
So,
For sure.
and if you don't have access to healthcare, it's hard to really organize politically anyways, right? So, yeah, dangerous, but definitely one possible way to organize politically.
Yeah, matter of fact, that's one of the tools that bosses use against their workers, right? So workers will come up and they'll ask their bosses for a raise, and their bosses will basically say, "Okay, but we're going to have to cut your healthcare benefits."
Yeah, exactly. So if they no longer have that cudgel over you, like, okay, you can cut my benefits. It doesn't matter though, because they're, state funded or whatever. Then at least the boss has to go lobby Congress to cut medical spending. And then it's more in the open. There are other lawmakers that can push back against that, or other, lobbyists that, are for more progressive causes or whatever. It's not just behind closed doors in some boardroom. At least ideally, hopefully it's a little bit more out in the open, because it's at least a little bit harder to keep those kinds of secrets in the halls of Congress. It's not impossible, and there's so much going on that stuff can be missed, but at least there's the potential for some kind of public transparency if it's, some kind of broader state administered kind of program.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would also say we're still in 2021 dealing with these socialist boogeyman arguments.
Yeah, exactly. So perhaps, and it's, I don't know, again, it's kind of a double-edged sword, because if you push socialism around as not a dirty word and you get the Bernie Sanders of the world and they get some success, on the one hand, that kind of deflates the anti-communist rhetoric to a degree. But on the other hand, you do also risk kind of watering down what socialism actually is. And then you end up with, like, the Nordic model, where there are definite improvements to their material conditions, but there's still,
Relying on
you know,
exploitation.
exactly. So, but then again, if you have better material conditions, hopefully then that allows you to prioritize getting rid of the next problem. So, it's tough. There are no easy solutions, unfortunately.
Yeah, and that's definitely one of the biggest problems in the US is there's obviously capitalism, but it's capitalism on another level because there is no broader social safety net in so many aspects.
Yeah, and that's why one of the things I criticize Obama for in the book, the title, "He was our man in Washington," that's a quote from a financial executive.
Mm,
Early in his administration, he had a meeting with, I think it was like 10 or half a dozen or around about, some of the top financial execs in the country. And they were pretty nervous. They didn't know what to expect from this new president, very progressive campaign promises and everything else. And he said flatly, "I'm the only thing between you and the pitchforks. I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to, help you, do the things that you guys are supposed to be doing." It's not like there's some conspiracy. It's just Obama really thought that these financial institutions had a valuable service to offer vis-a-vis issuing credit so that people could get loans, so they could start small businesses or grow the economy or what have you. His administration thought it was very important that loans were issued, credit was issued, money flowed properly. That would get the economy back on an even keel and help pretty much everyone. So after the meeting, one of the executives was quoted by a journalist as saying, "Wow, he's really our man in Washington," right? So I do criticize Obama pretty heavily in the book from that perspective, for not trying to, even within the limited confines of liberal politics, he didn't offer even the meagerest of social safety net reforms. Obamacare is incredibly limited in what it actually accomplishes, because, unless you're one of the people that got Medicaid expansion, which thanks to the Supreme Court is far fewer than it should have been, you're left with, at best, subsidized private insurance. And at worst, like, I know people who, they're successful, they make a couple of $100,000 a year or whatever, but they're also self-employed, they're authors or whatever the case may be, and their healthcare costs skyrocketed after Obamacare went into effect. So it's like obviously they're not like the poor working class, but they're also not the capitalist class, right? Maybe they're petit bourgeois or whatever you want to call them, but it did hurt people too, and it kind of hurts a lot of people in the sense that it's still allowed an integral place for private insurance companies, which being economic vampires that have no good purpose, they don't help anyone. All they're there to do is make money. That's a real fault of Obama's signature domestic policy accomplishment, right? It's kind of what's so frustrating about Biden. He doesn't want Medicare for all.
Yeah.
At best he wants a more bolstered Obamacare kind of thing, and that's really bad because that just gives private insurance companies more customers. It gives them more economic power. And then deductibles keep going up, care keeps going down, things don't get covered, and everyone suffers except for the insurance executives.
Yeah, I haven't even heard the Democrats talk about a public option recently. Like that
Yeah,
idea seems to have completely gone out the window too.
yeah, and it's tough, right? Because the Democrats, both political parties are kind of mushy coalitions, but the Democrats even, I think, are even more so. There's a much more obvious split between progressive Democrats and conservative Democrats than there
Right.
is between, libertarian Republicans and conservative Republicans. And so what that means is that you're left with a party that technically holds the power in two of the three federal branches, but not really, right? Because
Mhm.
their Senate majority is only because of the vice president, who is a conservative Democrat, and their House majority is dominated by Nancy Pelosi, who is also a conservative Democrat. So there's a split in the party as far as what actually needs to be accomplished, and we see that in the arguments over the infrastructure bill. I think one of the reasons that progressives haven't been able to push for Medicare for all is because they've gotten bogged down in this infrastructure debate. Understandable. I mean, you can only do one thing, one multi-trillion-dollar bill at a time, please. Like, all right, that's understandable. You can't do too much at once unless you want to do it improperly. But um, I think one of the main reasons that argument has gotten bogged down so much is because there's so much capitalist resistance among conservative Democrats who don't want to see this stuff enacted. They're very much in that neoliberal mindset of the markets need to handle this as much as possible, and that's Obama through and through. Argue in the book again and again that Obama is, a very neoliberal president. If the markets could solve it, they should be left to do that. And obviously, I think from our perspective on the left, that's not a very radical statement to make. It's not a very surprising statement, but it was certainly surprising to me when I began researching it. Again, I came from Hillsdale College. I thought Obama was a socialist until like 2014, when I,
Mhm.
kind of stopped caring all that much. So to read and discover that he's making, pretty vigorous defenses of capitalism, that he's saying markets can solve most things, that he's very reticent to use government regulation. That was all very surprising to me, which is one of the reasons I felt I had to write the book. Was I was like, well, I'm a pretty educated person. I think I have a good head on my shoulders, and I didn't know any of this stuff. So like, so many other people are probably not aware of these facts, and no one's talking about it. Everyone's talking about Trump because he's easy to talk about. He's easy to make content about.
Mhm.
Obama, love or hate his policies. As a person, he's kind of boring in a good way, right? Like he's not sleeping around. He's not mean to people. He's easy to get along with.
And
He's
that's what
got
the
this.
liberals love about him.
Yep, exactly. And he's a very likable guy.
Civility.
Yep. Yep. He embodies that. He's like Bill Clinton without the rape, um, which is great. Like from a liberal perspective, it's great if they could have a guy who's well spoken, civil, and also doesn't have any personal baggage. That's kind of the ideal for them. Unfortunately, on the policy level, it's pretty crappy. And so I really wanted to convey that in this book, especially to an audience that might not have been aware of some of these more essentially capitalistic qualities about his policies.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad that you did that because educating myself more on Obama's policies and both of his terms and reading your book, it just makes you angry because you hate Trump, as you said, obviously. He's a parasite in so many different ways, but it just makes you more angry because the shortcomings of Obama, it's so apparent that they led to Trump and Trumpism, which I'll get to later in this interview, but it just, it's very aggravating.
Yeah, certainly. You definitely get a missed opportunity sense from Obama. It's very depressing.
Okay, moving on. I wanted to get to some foreign policy. In chapter 1, you begin by talking about the forever wars. In section 1.2 of chapter 1, you list three main reasons why terrorism seemed particularly effective for Muslims resisting American hegemony in the Middle East. And I thought this was very interesting and very true. Number one was the Iranian Revolution proved that U.S. proxies were not invulnerable to indigenous pressure. The second one was Reagan's withdrawal of U.S. Marines from Lebanon after terrorist attacks there had killed more than 100 Americans in 1983, made terrorism look effective against direct American intervention. And the third reason was the defeat of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan and its subsequent political collapse, which gave men like Osama bin Laden a concrete sense of self importance, as they considered the resistance of the Mujahideen central to that victory. So, just wanted to say, I found those three reasons very compelling and interesting.
Thanks, I agree. I put it in the book, so yes, yeah. But I wanted to emphasize there just that like as much as the T word is used in a moralistic sense these days by everyone, you know, if you don't like someone, you call them a terrorist, right?
Mhm.
I see people do that with the January 6 rioters and stuff. But terrorism has a more precise definition, which people argue about here and there, but it's more or less just like using violence or the threat of violence for political ends. And that is something that pretty much everyone, good, bad, or indifferent, does. That's the whole point of war, right? Um, so now, obviously, with terrorism, you're usually targeting civilian populations, which is extremely controversial and everything. But at the same time, like, there's a reason why these people think that it's an effective tactic, especially within the material sense. Like, they don't have access to cruise missiles or fleets or any of that kind of stuff. So you kind of use what you got. You know, I have people that are very devoted to a cause and know how to use an AK-47, so I'm going to use them as best I can, right? So like just the idea that just because someone uses certain tactics means that they're automatically the epitome of evil or whatever. That's a very George W. Bush way of looking at the world, right?
Yeah.
It's so hard to say that without sounding like you're condoning their actions or supporting their beliefs. I'm very much not, but I did want to try and get away from that Manichaean, that black and white hard line there, because then it makes people who don't call themselves terrorists or who are not referred to as terrorists seem automatically good, right? No one talks about the U.S. as terrorists, so whoever we kill, it must be a good thing because we're not terrorists, right? It's just a very dangerous way of looking at foreign policy because it's foreign policy is annoyingly complicated in that way, right?
Yeah, it just sounds like an extension of American exceptionalism.
Yeah, exactly. What whoever we kill must have deserved it. It's like that's definitely not the case.
I know, which is just a continuation of colonialism and imperialism.
Yeah, and you can if you end up reading about the American Indian Wars, the savagery, quote unquote, that the white settlers described when the Indians were fighting was the exact kind of stuff that often the white settlers were doing to everyone around them, even if the Indians weren't doing it themselves. Sometimes the whites just lied about it, right? Um, and so it just kind of goes back to like, oh, whites are civilized. That's not how we conduct warfare, et cetera. And it's like, yes, it is.
Yeah,
But
scalping
we're
is probably the most glaring example of that, right?
Yeah, and there's definite historical debate about the origins of scalping, but it's at the very least, it is not clear if it was whites or indigenous people that started it. So the fact that there's serious, legitimate debate about that means that at the very least, it started very early on. It was adopted by both parties, whoever did it first. So um, it's warfare, right? Warfare is brutal, and we shouldn't be surprised when people act in a brutal manner when they're trying to use violence to obtain political ends. That's just how it's done by pretty much everyone. I think Europeans have refined it, perhaps more than other cultures have, and there are definite reasons for that, I think. But it's not unique to us, and it's certainly not unique to our enemies, that level of brutality. So, yeah, pretty dangerous mindset when you think that you're not doing anything terrible.
Yeah, absolutely. So I like the way that you wrote this book because it's clear to me that you were aware of the political climate that Obama walked into as president. However, I also wanted to say it's important to point out the glaring instances of Obama misleading the American people. In the context of 9/11, which was of course the main factor in driving America's forever wars, Obama promised to put an end to the blatant disregard of civil liberties that Bush enacted under the Patriot Act that was signed in his administration. And in 2007, Barack Obama publicly promised the American people, quote, "No more secrecy. That's a commitment I make to you as president. That means no more wiretapping of American citizens." In addition, Obama even vowed to support a filibuster of any bill that gave retroactive immunity to companies providing assistance to government spies. And what we're talking about right now is PRISM, which is a secretive program that was used to gather data from major internet companies that was later revealed in Snowden's leaks that was launched in 2007.
Yeah, and as it turns out, Obama, while he was still senator, supported the FISA Amendments Act, which did grant retroactive immunity to corporations that cooperated with those illegal wiretaps. So, whoops.
Yeah, I also wanted to say in 2012, Obama's Justice Department authorized the NSA to search internet cables on American soil without any warrants or evidence of computer hacking schemes that originating abroad. And also, there were secret memos from 2012 that said the NSA could watch any internet traffic flowing to, quote, suspicious addresses or containing malware, as well as monitor addresses and cyber signatures. So he was totally full of shit.
Yeah, and it's tough, right? Because when you look carefully at the kind of criticism that Obama was leveling at the Bush administration, it wasn't actually that civil liberties are being violated. It's that civil
The
liberties are
law,
being,
right? That's what you
yeah,
said.
yep, it's that civil liberties are being violated illegally. So the idea is sometimes in war it's necessary to do bad things. Okay, like broadly that's probably true because it's war. Okay, well, one of those bad things, if we're going to fight terrorism effectively, might be some violating civil liberties. Okay, you're losing me a little bit. Okay, and in order for us to violate those civil liberties properly, because as a mainstream liberal Democrat, I very much care about going through the proper channels. We're going to make sure this stuff is legal and that there's at least some degree of paper trail and accountability. We're going to use these FISA courts, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act
Hmm.
courts, so that there's some kind of accountability. Now, of course, the problem is no one really pays that much attention to the FISA courts. They're not like democratically accountable because judges almost never are. The paperwork's always secret. And when you're talking about surveillance and spying and stuff, kind of by definition, there's not a lot of transparency. So pretty quickly, you run into these problems where even if the intentions were to rein it in or put some kind of controls on it, once that cat's out of the bag, once that Patriot Act was signed into law, it's pretty hard to actually do this properly. Now, in theory, that's not to say you could never do it properly. I mean, because obviously, any legitimate state, not that the US is, but any legitimate state is going to want to know what's going on outside its borders to a degree for security reasons. Like, this stuff isn't in the aggregate necessarily terrible. But of course, when you're doing it in service of the American empire to defend stolen land, you run into a lot of problems over and above the individual nitty gritty, implementation of policy.
Hmm. Which is why it's particularly alarming when Americans are so willing to give in to violations of civil liberties to get quote unquote security and protection.
Yeah, and that's also why I wanted to kind of push back against that terrorism narrative because, painting these enemy combatants as almost beyond humanity in what they're capable of doing scares a lot of people. It makes this kind of political boogeyman, and pretty quickly you're willing to give up a lot of your constitutional rights, a lot of your human rights, to fight what seems like a completely intractable enemy. And it's the kind of rhetoric that makes negotiation and compromise all but impossible. So that's the reason, for instance, why we have been at secret war with Iran for 2 generations, because they've been viewed as a terrorist state by the federal government for decades now, and the American people have been pumped full of that propaganda. So, not to say Iran is a perfect place or that I like their government or anything, but when you paint them as different than, say, the dictatorship in Saudi Arabia, which seems to me like a much worse place. Um,
Hmm. No doubt.
then all of a sudden you give the government carte blanche, a blank check to do whatever the hell they want. to this enemy of the state. And so I think that's why it's very useful to get beyond that pure good, pure evil rhetoric, um, because it helps us kind of put it's a reality check, right? The kind of the grays of foreign policy. It's hard to find anybody that's perfect because, oh my God, these are all countries made up of people. What a surprise. But if you treat them as actual entities with goals and motivations and things that they might be willing to compromise on themselves, then you can avoid unnecessary conflict and unnecessary war and things like that. So at the very least, I think that's pretty important for making sure that new wars don't happen. It's hard to, commit to democratic reform domestically when we keep getting into new wars and have to spend more money on that stuff, you know?
Yeah, it's really weird when we have like permanent occupation within other countries and people in those countries start to rise up against us. It it's almost like they don't like that.
Yeah, who'd have thunk it, right? That these people, they might not want America telling them how to behave and how to
Yeah,
be
like
governed.
somebody that I look up to, I can't remember who it was, basically said, think about, we're always thinking about this like from an American perspective, right? So think about the flip side of that. Think if like China were to just invade Texas and just start seizing oil fields, and then they just say, hey, we're just going to stay here for 20 years. The United States would immediately consider that an act of war, rightfully so. But we don't view it that way when it's in another country.
Yeah, and that goes back to Manifest Destiny and the fact that America, is a shining city on the hill. It's kind of a touched by God kind of country that has a special mission in the world. And for neoconservatives and their liberal backers, uh, their liberal co-conspirators, that means they get to do whatever they want in the foreign policy realm, invade whoever they want, sanction whoever they want, drone strike whoever they want. It's a very incredibly dangerous, destabilizing mindset.
Yeah, very dangerous and no words to describe it really, just horrible. In section 1.3 in chapter 1 within the War on Terror, interminable. In this part of the book, you begin by discussing the fact that Obama, after winning the 2008 election, decided to keep Bush II's defense secretary Robert Gates, a very odd choice given that Obama had run on being a non-interventionist president. I didn't know that. I had no idea that he kept Bush II's defense secretary. You said, I think, all the way until 2011, correct?
Yeah, and the reason that Gates stepped down was because he didn't feel like being in politics anymore. It wasn't that Obama got rid of him. It's just Gates had been defense secretary at that point for like 5 years, which is a long time to be a defense secretary through two administrations. So
Hmm.
he ended up just retiring. So yeah, it speaks to a couple things. Obama definitely wanted to be seen as reaching across the aisle, which is legitimate. He's the first black man who's president. He's trying to ameliorate conservative concerns about him being some kind of other. He's trying to put a damper on, oh, he's a Muslim, he's from Indonesia, whatever kind of rhetoric. Like if he's seen as having a strong national defense, perhaps Republicans will give him more leeway on domestic issues because they're not going to see him as some kind of weak liberal, peacenik. So it's like it's understandable in that sense. He tried to do it. He also thought that legitimately the war on terror needed to be fought. From his perspective, Bush didn't do it very well, but 9/11 did require, in Obama's mind, a muscular response. In 2008, at a campaign speech, he talked about how he was going to have like a muscular, strong kind of foreign policy. It's not so much non-intervention as much as smart intervention. Maybe midway through his presidency, they started adopting this phrase of what's the Obama doctrine? Don't do stupid shit. That's what they said inside the administration circles because they were like, that was the main problem with Bush. It's just that he did too many dumb things. It wasn't that Osama bin Laden shouldn't have been dealt with via a military solution. It was just, forgetting about Afghanistan and barreling into Iraq were really dumb things to have done. So that was the Obama war on terror strategy was let's just be smarter about fighting the war, but the war still has to be fought. So you got, attempts at bipartisanship, trying to, recalibrate the war on terror, but give a sense of continuity so that we can keep fighting it properly. Yeah, and that's the kind of stuff that really surprised me with Obama's presidency, because I also didn't really remember that he had done that, or that he expanded the war on terror into Africa, or drastically increased drone strikes, because he thought drone strikes were a smarter alternative to using large numbers of soldiers to do invasions. So that's one of the reasons he did that. Or he drastically increased the use of Special Operations Command, SOCOM. So doing night raids and things like that, more precision strikes, quote unquote, as opposed to large invasions.
Hmm. I wanted to ask you about Guantanamo Bay and Obama's promises to end the torture program that was carried out by the Bush administration. You explicitly stated that Obama misled the American people by saying, quote, "Indeed, those waiting with bated breath for Obama to end unilaterally the indefinite detentions at Guantanamo, pull U.S. troops from across the world and bring them home, or investigate the full length and breadth of Bush II's many crimes against humanity, had misread their man. Obama had been critical of Bush II for some time, but always from the perspective of method, not goal. For instance, he questioned national surveillance practices, not because they intrinsically violated civil liberties, but because the way Bush II's team had implemented them violated the rule of law." Yeah, so that's what we were talking about, right? And that's because he came from that background where he was a constitutional lawyer. And so he was just concerned about aesthetics really the entire time, right? Like, as long as we can get through these loopholes and do things technically legally, all of these things that Bush was doing were really necessary. I just didn't agree exactly with the way that he carried them out.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so Guantanamo Bay, for example, the Obama Justice Department tried to get away from the military tribunals and go through the normal criminal justice system to try some of these people, but they got too much pushback against that, so they had to scrap that. They tried to get these detainees off the island, but Congress literally passed a law saying that they couldn't do that. So that's an interesting example of, obviously the Obama administration did not see Guantanamo Bay as a very useful place. We have to fight the war on terror. We got to have these suspects go somewhere. But Guantanamo Bay is obviously, it's a propaganda nightmare. People, rightfully, in some cases, even Obama would admit that there was some, mistreatment of prisoners at Guantanamo Bay. So it's a PR nightmare. So from his perspective, let's get rid of Guantanamo, because that will take the wind out of some of the anti-American propaganda. But even his opponents were so intractable. The idea that whatever Obama does, we have to oppose it, that they couldn't even see what, from a neoliberal and neoconservative perspective, is a pretty reasonable thing, right? Let's disperse these prisoners so that they're not such a big political tool our enemies can use, and then we can move on with our lives. So he ended up, by the end of his second term, due to additional humanitarian pressure, he did empty the prison pretty thoroughly, drastically reducing the number of inmates, but couldn't close it, despite his efforts to do so. And to a degree, that's not his fault. It's that was Congress that was kind of in the way of that. But even when he had a majority in Congress, he was not willing to put his political capital to the test and really close it, because, as I said a little bit earlier, he did not want to be seen as weak on foreign policy, because he thought that would threaten his domestic agenda.
Yeah, there was definitely a lot of pressure from the right in that sense. I mean, I remember I was a lot younger when Obama was president, but I remember the blatant obstruction that the GOP would levy towards him with anything.
Yeah, and that's why, even from the left, it's
You got to
tough.
be fair.
Yeah, you got to be fair with Obama, because even when he had a good idea, he had a really hard time passing it. That's why it's not all his fault. But even the ideas that he managed to get through were not great ideas. I think, like we mentioned, Obamacare being the primary example of that. Even when he got his success, it was uh, pretty crappy in a lot of ways.
Can you talk about the terrorist attack that took place on Christmas Day in 2009 with I can't pronounce his name probably, Abdul Muttalib?
Yeah, so that was a huge controversy because it made the Obama administration seem very weak on the war on terror. Oh, we almost had another quote unquote 9/11. You know, this has been framed as Obama's 9/11 in some circles, in the sense that it really hardened the administration towards reforming the war on terror. So, for those that don't remember, this was this guy. He brought in some kind of chemical explosive onto a plane right around Christmas, and it went off when he was on the plane, but it malfunctioned, and so the flight crew were like, they come across this guy who's burning up, like literally he had like very massive burns all over his body, but the bomb didn't actually explode. And so, he got a lot of criticism because he allowed the FBI to handle it and go through semi-normal criminal channels, with interrogations and things like that, instead of just handing him over to the CIA to, butcher. The Obama administration let the FBI, interrogate him as a semi-normal criminal suspect would be interrogated. And so when the guy stopped talking, using his right to remain silent or whatever, there was a lot of criticism from the right. Oh, how come he didn't just torture him? And so, fair play to Obama's administration, they didn't just torture him, which is better than nothing.
Mm-hmm.
But by that point,
Low bar.
and by that point, as the Obama administration tried to point out again and again, they had already gotten a lot of information from the guy because he was relatively willing to talk for a while. And that's true basically of all torture. It doesn't actually give you much information. People are going to talk if they want to. And if you torture them, they're just going to say whatever they think you want to hear to get you to stop hurting them. So it's usually a lot easier to get information from someone if you're buddy buddy with them, kind of thing. But anyways, so the real importance of that bombing attempt was that it made Obama seem weak on the war on terror, and so hardened a lot of his perhaps more initially progressive orientations towards that. Like he was never not going to fight it, but now he was going to be seen fighting it more aggressively because he had to, backpedal a lot of that stuff because of that PR fallout.
Yeah, and more importantly, all of that distracted away from the reason that Abdullah Muttalib provided for the bombing. He said, quote, he blamed the United States for its, quote, killing of innocent and civilian Muslim populations in Palestine, as well as for Americans' killing of innocent and civilian Muslim populations in Yemen, Iraq, Somalia, Afghanistan, and beyond, most of them women, children, and non combatants. So all of that gets kind of erased because the right goes, Obama wasn't tough enough on terrorism.
Yeah, and this is kind of a vicious cycle that keeps happening where we overreact to an attack or an attempted attack, and all it does is ratchet up the violence on our part and give more and more fuel to those that are trying to recruit more fighters. So if I make this point in the book, if we stop bombing these places, it's going to be a lot harder for the Al Qaeda's of the world to recruit fighters, because it's not going to be, the US isn't going to be seen as the thing that's killing all of them, because we're not going to be doing it anymore, right?
Yeah.
If we pull the troops out, stop killing them, give them back their political sovereignty, now all of a sudden they have their own problems to deal with that aren't necessarily our fault. So they're not, like, people don't just go pick up an AK and go kill. It takes a lot of effort and energy and a lot of pushing them. They have to feel like their backs are against the wall. It's like when people go out and protest or riot or go on strike. For the most part, we don't like doing that. It's a huge pain in the ass. I'd rather just get up and go to work and lead a normal existence. Like, being political in that way takes a ton of energy and dedication, and most are not pushed to that point unless their material conditions are relatively desperate, or they don't really seem like they have a lot of hope through normal, proper channels. So if I'm a Muslim living in Egypt and all I see around me are, police states armed by the American government, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Syria, whoever it happens to be, like, they all use Western hardware one way or the other. Syria obviously is not our friend right now, but they have been in the past. Osama bin Laden, benefited from CIA assets in the 80s. Saddam Hussein was a CIA asset in the 70s. Like all this stuff keeps blowing back on us. So it would be wonderful is if we could just pull back and let that anger kind of diminish, you know?
Yeah, that would be nice. Um, if we didn't have our permanent military occupation in so many different countries and we were willing to offer refugees asylum into our country and provide so much more humanitarian aid, yeah, we would not be nearly as hated. And I should be clear about this too. Most people in other countries are intelligent enough not to hate Americans directly. They levy their anger more towards our government, which is what they
Yeah,
should do.
yeah. I mean, that's specifically why Osama bin Laden targeted the World Trade Center because it wasn't like it was just some random building with Americans in it. He saw that as a symbol and representation of American empire. You know, with tons of people in there working to further that, not by military means, but by financial means. So,
Yeah, like the
you know,
financial center of American capitalism, besides like Wall Street.
exactly. So it's not like he's targeting random civilians. He's targeting civilians that he saw as specifically a part of the American imperial project.
Yeah, I have a question for you right now. What are the major differences and similarities that you see between neoliberalism and neoconservatism with regards to US foreign policy?
So neoliberalism, it's these terms are always very confusing, right? So just to clarify, neoliberalism is an economic philosophy, like an economic ideology. You can also call it neoclassical economics. The idea that markets can solve most, if not all, problems. Things should be privatized. Regulation should be kept to a minimum. The job of the government is to facilitate contract negotiations between private parties. And so you can solve most problems through private arbitration. And if you get the government out of the way, people will just kind of deal with it themselves. And there's something a little bit appealing there in an anarchistic sense. Like, yeah, people can just deal with their problems on their own. But of course, we're dealing with these large institutions with various degrees of power relations and dynamics. And so you're not really dealing with individuals solving problems. You're dealing with corporations that have immense power over many individuals, so that the marketplace, quote unquote, is not a fair, equitable place for arbitration to be carried out. So that's neoliberalism. Neoconservatism is a foreign policy doctrine that came about, developed in the 70s and 80s, and really came to its own in the 90s. And it basically says that America is, it is basically an empire, and we have a right to exert our preeminence and our power wherever we see fit. And the most effective way to do that from a neoconservative's perspective is preemptive war. So let's not bother with diplomacy or sanctions or all that crap. We'll throw that out of the way and just have a very energetic militaristic foreign policy. And these rogue regimes or whatever that don't accept the neoliberal order, they're going to have to be dealt with very harshly. And so that's why Afghanistan was bombed all of 5 seconds after the 9/11 attack. That's why Iraq was invaded in 2003, barely 2 years after the attacks. And right after 9/11, the Bush administration went to work trying to figure out how to get Iraq next. Iraq was like one of the countries they really wanted to go after as, a rogue nation, right? Saddam Hussein made a big deal about kind of bucking the international trend and thumbing his nose at the world order, so to speak. And neoconservatives hate that kind of stuff. And so one of the things that neocons want to do is go into these countries, overthrow their governments, and then implement neoliberalism into those countries. Free trade, open markets, basically allowing U.S. corporations to go in and make huge profits. It's supposed to be a level playing field. That's how it's advertised, but of course it never is, because these American corporations are multi-billion-dollar entities going into blasted landscapes with completely destabilized populations that can't really you know push back very effectively. So neoconservatism is a particularly militaristic way to implement neoliberal economic models on other countries.
Oh, really well said. Thank you for elaborating on that. So, in chapter 2, you talked about the economy. Obama obviously inherited the financial crisis of 2008, which was caused by the subprime mortgage crisis. Let's fast forward 3 years. It's 2011. The Occupy Wall Street movement is raging across the US. The movement is largely one that was formed out of the failures of the first Obama term to lift up the working class and the poor from the crushing impacts of 2008. So I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on Obama's treatment of the Occupy Wall Street protesters?
Um, I wish I'd spent more time on that in the book, but he was very dismissive of them, and he was very dismissive of a lot of those kinds of street protests. If you look specifically at one of the successors to Occupy, the Black Lives Matter movement, which grew out of a lot of the experiences of the Occupy movement, Obama responded to BLM with, hey, come have a talk with me. He invited one of the founders of Black Lives Matter to a conference, and she responded very forcefully, like, no, it's not about having a seat at the table of power. It's about upending the whole thing, right? I'm not very interested in your liberal platitudes. And that's really all Obama offered, if he offered anything to the Occupy movement. It was very much because his economic policy was very much, let's just get the status quo going again, get back to the Clinton days, and then the economy will grow and people will be able to, get their house payments going again, and that'll help a lot of people if there's credit available and if loans are being issued and if businesses are humming again. He didn't really have a lot of policy space for direct federal intervention, say in the foreclosure crisis, or in even in healthcare. Right, there was indirect federal help vis-a-vis subsidies for insurance plans, but there wasn't like a direct kind of public option. Even when that was in the Obamacare legislation, when it was going through Congress, Obama didn't really support it. So that's what you can really say about his relationship to the Occupy movement, is that if he offered them any sympathy, it was pretty boilerplate, and for the most part, he did not have a lot of respect for those movements because they went outside normal political channels. And I think for him, like, he saw his presidency as a continuation of the civil rights movement, right? That's how he framed it in his 2008 campaign. And his point was, hey, you guys worked so hard on the streets doing all this important work, and now look at me. I am the result of this. Not in any kind of egotistical way, I'm not necessarily, but just like, look what you're,
Like
look what,
representation
yeah,
was enough.
exactly.
They
Like,
didn't need to have rising material conditions. It was just who we had a black man as president.
yeah, and the idea is, black faces in high places is very important because that'll allow us, not only as a race, but as, working class people. Like, this is what America promises, right? So you've already delivered on that as the civil rights movement. So we don't really need more street protests because that's been delivered. So if we can just use correct political channels to, strip away some of the conservative nonsense that has, hurt the country and get back to that liberal status quo, that's going to help a lot of people. And so he didn't really see the need for Occupy Wall Street, I think, in that sense.
Do you know if he used the military or like federal agents to crack down on Occupy Wall Street protesters like he did with Black Lives Matter?
So I don't remember any research that he specifically used law enforcement to crack down on Occupy, but I know that law enforcement did, on of its own accord, do that. Um, Even at the national level, there was like anti-terrorism related communication between various law enforcement departments. Um, going between state lines, trying to compare notes and talk about these organizers as if they were like domestic terrorists. So I don't know, or I'm not aware of evidence that came as a directive from the Obama administration, one way or the other, or his Justice Department. But I do reference in the book a couple of times that law enforcement agencies were taking it upon themselves to look at the Occupy movement through that lens. And that's something that's obviously a long, long legacy going back to COINTELPRO in the 60s or the Red Scare of 1919.
Mm-hmm.
How the federal government dealt with railroad strikers in the 1870s, right? Like, this is a long history of the military being used to crack down on domestic dissent. The Whiskey Rebellion in the 1790s,
Kent
right?
State.
Yeah, Kent State, exactly. But it's not often directed by the presidential office itself. It's directed by the FBI or local National Guard units or whatever the case may be. It's because America is still a semi-federalized system with overlapping and confused and complex jurisdictions, especially with law enforcement. It's just a complete mess. But because that's the case, a lot of these institutions, maybe they're using federal funds to purchase M16s or radio gear, helicopters or whatever, drones, but they're often operating on their own initiative for this kind of stuff.
Gotcha. Okay. In terms of the right wing, what factors do you think led to the rise of the Tea Party?
So part of it is the material conditions not getting better, right? It doesn't help things when conservative working class people are losing factory jobs or are not seeing their incomes go up, or they're on unemployment, or they just see that the economy is going downhill, and they see that even the Democrats in office are supporting the big banks, bailing out the auto industry and things like that. So that's the first thing. Like, Obama's not helping himself with these neoliberal policies.
No, because he's the wealthy coastal elite that they all think of.
Exactly. And so that's the thing with conservatives, right? That's the thing that Rush Limbaugh would always do. They take a kernel of truth. The wealthy coastal elites are indeed real, and their policies often do not economically help poor people or working class people. That's all very true. They have a contempt for blue collar America. That's usually true. But then they take it and they twist it, and they find, instead of looking at the system itself, instead of looking in the mirror, conservative what we want to call them, grifters, will instead find some kind of other group, some kind of outside group to put the blame on. So the Tea Party starts with these material economic conditions, puts a racist face on it. Because obviously, like, not all libertarians are racist, but they're certainly comfortable hanging out with racists if they're not themselves.
Yeah, you ever hear about the ANCAP to fascist pipeline?
Yes. Yep. So, or the Pewdie pipeline, right?
Hmm.
Um, as non-compete would put it, like, there's an uncomfortable degree of overlap. Even if you look at Ron Paul, who for a while was kind of the standard bearer of libertarianism, he was pretty racist. Some of his publications from the 90s they use a lot of those kind of racist dog whistles. I make a couple of examples of that in the book, as I recall. So even if he's not being like out and out racist himself, he is perfectly comfortable taking advantage of redneck bigotry to kind of build that libertarian movement. And so the result of all that is the Tea Party, which was part backlash against coastal elite, and very large part backlash against what a lot of white people saw as them being knocked off the top of the economic pyramid, and a misdiagnosis of what the problem was. So the problem is that union jobs are being shipped overseas because corporations have completely, unregulated power, and the means of production is privately owned, and that kind of thing. It's not that black people are taking the jobs, or that political correctness is run amok, or that we've elected a Muslim as president. Like, that was, I'll often get Facebook comments about, when I advertise my book, oh, Obama was a Muslim. Okay, well, putting aside the fact that, like, why would that even be a problem? What the hell, dude? Like, just the misinformation campaign that these people fell prey to, which was funded by conservative rich people because they're playing this partisan game. That's something I think on the left we have to always keep in mind, is that even though there is a ruling class, they hate each other, and they're perfectly willing to fight each other if they're the ones that, if they think they're going to benefit and get more of the massive economic pie they already own as a class, right? So that's why even Republican establishment people hated Donald Trump when he was running for president,
Oh yeah,
because he's a very easy guy to hate. I was
until he was
reading.
the nominee.
Exactly. And then they rallied around him because they recognized that, okay, well, we still have to get into political power, right? So yeah, we have to remember that there are divisions even within the ruling class, even within the capitalist class, and the Tea Party was one manifestation of that. It was one part of the capitalist class trying to use working class anger tinged with racial resentment to fight another part of the capitalist class. And it worked really well for a couple years at least.
Yeah, so really it comes down to just lack of material conditions for working class people. And I've talked to several of my comrades about this concept before, where basically we say, look, we can relate a lot more to working class right wing people than these wealthy centrists.
Yeah, that's certainly true, and that's not to discount other intersections of oppression, right? I do talk in my book about
Mhm.
like there are
Absolutely.
multiple vectors that these things come on because obviously a racist working class white person is still going to step on the neck of a working class black person if they think it's going to be in their interest. So like you uh, as the Soviet Union found, even when you better material conditions, there are still other problems that society has that might be related to capitalism, let's say patriarchy or racism, that aren't going to be immediately solved by democratic ownership of the economy. But you're never going to solve those problems without that either. It's
It's like long
necessary.
cultural ties.
Yep, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. So I think as long as we remember that racism isn't just going to magically go away when worker co-ops become the default, I think that's definitely a good headspace to be in. And the Democrats never help themselves when they make the economic life of the working class harder, because it's if you're economically desperate, it's going to be much easier. You're much more susceptible to those conspiracy theories.
Yeah, definitely. It's easy to just pay attention to the facts when everything's going well.
Yep. Yeah. It gives you the time and the space and the leisure to do your own research.
Hmm. I wanted to get to climate change now. So Obama did do some great things to help battle climate change, such as get the U.S. into the International Paris Climate Accord agreement in 2015. He also signed numerous executive orders into law that reduced the domestic carbon footprint and increased acreage of American public lands. However, Obama had a serious opportunity to deliver a final blow to the climate crisis, and he failed. I should also add this: these most basic measures were largely implemented in Obama's second presidential term. So these weren't even things that he was doing in his first term. With regards to environmental policy, Obama's first term looked a lot like George Bush's. Bush, of course, didn't give a shit about the climate crisis. He was, after all, a man that came from a family who made their fortune in oil. As a matter of fact, Obama opened up large areas of federal lands to oil and natural gas development. His administration even bragged about it. Remarkably, Obama had even recently cited America's output of oil under his administration as an achievement while the world sits on the brink of complete ecological collapse. What do you make of these recent comments?
So I think there's a couple of things. The first is that the Obama administration had two mutually exclusive goals. The first was energy security, because the Obama administration recognized that one of the paradoxes of the Bush administration's war on terror fight was the fact that we were fighting terrorists that were often funded by oil money that Americans paid for. A lot of it
Hmm.
was Saudi Arabian oil and that kind of thing. So one of the things Obama wanted to do was stop importing Middle Eastern oil into the U.S. or into other Western countries, um, and make the U.S. more energy independent, which would help the security situation in a number of ways. One of which was cutting off some of the funding for terrorism. The other thing that they wanted to do was fight climate change, and the U.S. federal government, as a rule, will always prioritize national security over the environment. So when push came to shove, the Obama administration decided that it was better to continue the Bush era increase in domestic fossil fuel production, even if it meant pushing back or contradicting their climate change policies. Now, Obama in his first term, you mentioned the difference in approach between the first and the second terms. So in his first term, because he had a Democratic majority for a little bit of that, he did try and champion domestic legislative reform. So instead of going through executive order, he wanted to try and get legislation passed, which in the long run is a better way to do it because executive orders can be repealed a lot more easily than legislation can. Now, of course, that got lost among the Recovery Act debate and the Obamacare debate. And so the climate change legislation that Democrats pushed tried to push through and Obama supported ultimately was dead. But even if it had passed, what he was championing was a neoliberal solution to climate change, setting up a carbon market where you can buy and sell carbon emissions. So if you're a company that is going to
Cap
emit
and trade.
yeah, exactly, a cap and trade. So you try and cap the national, output, and then allow companies to trade their individual output, so that if I'm not going to produce as much this year, I can trade. Ford can trade some of their excess output to GM, so GM can use a little bit more, factory, production capacity, kind of thing. And this is what the EU has done. And obviously, it's better than nothing, but also it's not great. And recently, for instance, with the economic recession, the UK actually started increasing its carbon emissions again, because no one had any money or credit to buy any of these carbon credits. So it's not. Even if it were an imperfect solution, it's definitely not a sustainable one, because markets can't be trusted for these kinds of long-term projects. So even if Obama had gotten his climate change stuff passed in his first term, it would have been a pretty mixed bag, even if it had gone into effect. Um, and so in his second term, he turned more to executive action, signed the Paris Climate Accord. Although how much good that's actually done for the world is pretty debatable. It's almost like it was more a moral victory than anything else.
Yeah.
Um, and he had his clean power plan that he tried to get through the EPA, and that got stopped by Republican litigation. And the Trump administration, if I recall correctly, they basically dismantled it. But the main victory Obama had in climate change was in the Recovery Act, because that issued billions of dollars to clean energy research, which did have real benefits, in increasing our knowledge and ability to implement solar and wind power in particular. But it was an incredibly mixed bag with the fossil fuel production increases, and with the Obama administration's support of building pipelines, which in the last chapter of the book I talk about from an indigenous perspective, because really effectively fighting climate change also means dealing with American imperialism and how we treat indigenous people, because a lot of these resources are extracted from land that was stolen from indigenous nations. And so when you're a progressive Democrat who's supposed to be environmentally friendly and says that they honor indigenous peoples and their traditions, and then you go and you provide federal support for pipeline construction, up to and including, National Guard units and surveillance and things like that. That sends a mixed message at best.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember the extent to how bad the protesters at Standing Rock were brutalized.
Yeah, that was one of the things that kind of radicalized me a little bit, because it's 2014 with the Ferguson protests, and then 2016 with the Standing Rock, protests like those. Seeing those cops and how brutal they were being to those people, like, it kind of wakes you up a little bit. Like, wait, what were they doing wrong? They were defending their land. Why are why are the police being so brutal to them? Oh, because they're just corporate stooges. Oh, that's not great.
Yeah, I remember those comparisons kept on getting levied during the Black Lives Matter protests, because you would look at the way that the government would respond to Black Lives Matter protests and Standing Rock protesters in comparison to like January 6th or like Proud Boys standing on the street. Like it's night and day.
Yeah, or the Tea Party. Yep.
Hmm.
Yep.
So, my last question for you, Owen, is how has the Democrats' favor of neoliberalism over appealing to working class interests, also known as how the Democrats used to be, like kind of the FDR era Democrats, and the right's favor of fake populism impacted American politics?
Interesting question. So, I mean, this has been kind of a long time brewing, basically since the 1960s, because up until the 60s, the political parties were not, for the most part, ideologically coherent. You had the New Deal coalition on with the Democrats, and that was mostly working class, but the Republicans, they had more big business interests on their side, but there were still plenty of Republicans who, like, for instance, Prescott Bush, like the grandfather of George W. Bush, was pro-abortion. right? I think he was like on the board of Planned Parenthood or whatever. Like he, had some pretty okay policies. There were Republicans who were anti-imperialist.
Wait, you said
Um,
pro-abortion. You mean
yep.
anti-abortion?
No, he was pro-abortion. Like
Oh,
he was,
okay.
he
Yeah, yeah.
was, yeah, he was pro-choice, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Which is such a weird thing to think about, like a Republican that's pro-choice. Um, but with the '60s and the backlash to the civil rights movement, you had a realignment of the political parties where all the racist conservatives went to the Republicans over the course of the '70s and '80s. Um, and so what you were left with by the '90s were these parties that were kind of at each other's throats. And so even though economically their policies are often very similar, there was still this growing partisan divide and it went into overdrive under Obama because of course now the Democrats have a black man as their figurehead, which threw a lot of Republicans into just conniption. Um, and so, but it's incredibly frustrating at the same time because you'll get these pseudo populists on the right who recognize legitimate economic grievances, twist it into a racialized, often racialized, but sometimes it's like more cultural, like Jordan Peterson kind of thing.
Hmm.
The cultural Marxists are coming for our whatevers.
Like
Um,
a Josh Hawley, right? Like Josh Hawley was pushing for $2,000 checks for everybody when Trump was still president, but when Biden got elected, he immediately dropped that. Never talked about it again.
Yeah, and so they'll often use these populist things as a cudgel when the Democrats are in power, and then once they get in power, they'll just implement tax cuts or whatever. So it's incredibly frustrating because it means that neither political party is an effective safety valve for working class grievances, because the way that capitalist liberal democracy is supposed to maintain its stability is that uh, you know if you want to look at it cynically, the political parties allow some grievances to be answered periodically so that things don't get bad enough that people start questioning, okay, who actually owns the means of production.
Hmm.
But we're at a point in our politics now where that system is like completely broken down, and we can't even pass a watered down infrastructure bill um, that would benefit a ton of people. Um, so some people see a lot of optimism in that. Oh, if things get bad enough, then the working class will wake up. And I think there's some truth in that. There's also a lot of danger because the worse things get, obviously, like diabetics aren't going to be able to afford insulin, or cops are going to be given more power to police poor and people of color. So
Yeah, be very
that
careful what you wish for.
exactly, that kind of accelerationist mindset can be pretty dangerous. And I was seeing some discussion on Twitter today about oh, this is what a civil war would look like with a map of the U.S. And there's all this all the population centers are blue and all the empty land is red or whatever the case is. And it's like I wouldn't be so flippant about talking about civil war because it never goes the way you think it's going to. It always drags on, and they're always incredibly violent. So it's as much as I like the fact that the ruling class is kind of floundering and there's lots of labor strikes and people are not afraid to use their the power of walking away from a job, that's all great. But as this partisan rhetoric gets increasingly violent, Marjorie Taylor Greene issuing a political ad where she's using a Barrett 50 caliber sniper rifle to blow up uh, you know
Socialism
liberalism.
car.
Yeah, exactly. Socialism car. Like that's a bad sign because that means that we're not going to be able to solve our political differences through nonviolent or maybe semi-nonviolent means. And if it gets to like organized conflict, that's going to be bad for everyone. I'm
Yeah,
not looking forward to
absolutely.
that. Yeah.
Side note, I was thinking about when she did that. Think about if you flip the ideology there. Think about if it was a socialist that like shot a gun at a car that had the word capitalism written on it. That person would immediately be placed on an FBI watch list.
Yep. Now, I mean, the FBI is in kind of a funny spot because as much as historically they've always targeted left-wing groups, every now and again they do target the KKK or some right-wing group when they get a little too out of line. So it does make you wonder, like, all right, at what point are the guys at the FBI, the James Comeys of the world, going to go like, all right, this is a little too unhinged even for my taste.
Yeah, because it's one thing if it's just a random person. This is a sitting member of Congress.
Yeah, and it reminds me a lot of like in the 1850s, the senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, who is probably the greatest senator we've ever had. He was arguing for abolition with no compensation to the masters in the 1850s. I mean, the guy was like pretty legendary because the idea was like, you're going to emancipate the slaves. Well, we have to pay the masters for their lost property. And Charles Sumner is like, what are you, high? Don't
Yeah,
do
you out
that.
of your mind? I
Yeah.
I heard about that recently. The
Yeah. It's,
entire concept that the U.S.
mhm.
Reimbursed the slave masters, and they did the same thing in the UK.
Yep, pretty messed up. So, but anyways, like in the 1850s, he made some speech about how slavery was evil, and he got the crap beaten out of him by a colleague, with a cane. That kind of thing you read about in history textbooks. And he had to take a
Skimmed right
couple.
over that.
Yep, he had to take a couple of years off because he was so beat up. But that's the kind of political climate you had in the 1850s, and I think that's the same climate we have now. Um, which is pretty unsettling because the Civil War was not fun to live through. So,
Definitely not.
yeah.
Owen, do you have anything that you'd like to plug? Your social media accounts or ways that people can get a hold of you?
Yeah, so I spend far too much time on Twitter. So that's at Owen_Symes, SYM as in Mary, ES. You can find more information about the book, He Was Our Man in Washington, A History of the Obama Years, at johnhuntpublishing.com. Yeah, those are the two main things I want people to take away, I guess.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I had a great time talking with you, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, have a great rest of your night.
You too.
All right, take care. 805 Uncensored is on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. You can follow us on there. You can also listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever else you get your podcasts. You can also email us if you have any suggested episode ideas or guests you'd like to have on. Peace out, everyone.